Buenos Aires, May 1960. A man named Ricardo Klement steps off a bus after finishing his shift as an assembly line foreman at a Mercedes-Benz automotive plant. He walks through the middle-class suburb of San Fernando toward his small brick house, passing a parked car where two men pretend to work under the open hood. Lightning flashes across the Argentine sky. Within seconds, Ricardo Klement vanishes into the darkness, dragged into the vehicle by Israeli intelligence agents who know his real name, Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. For 15 years, one of the most wanted men in the world had lived openly in Argentina, his escape made possible by a shadowy network of priests, diplomats and spies. Eichmann was not alone. Thousands of Nazi war criminals had found sanctuary in South America, protected by escape routes they called ratlines that stretched from the rubble of Berlin to the shores of Buenos Aires. This is the story of how they got there, who helped them, and why so many evaded justice for decades. The mass flight of Nazi war criminals to South America did not happen by accident. It was the product of years of planning, opportunism, and collaboration between unlikely partners united by a common fear: the spread of Soviet communism. As early as 1944, with the war's outcome increasingly clear, Nazi officials began preparing for defeat. SS operatives arrived in Madrid to establish the first links in what would become an international smuggling operation. By 1946, this network had expanded to Buenos Aires, where its operations were reportedly coordinated from the Argentine presidential palace itself. The conditions that made these escapes possible began taking shape years before the Third Reich collapsed. Argentina, home to one of the largest German immigrant communities outside Europe, had maintained close ties with Germany throughout the war. While officially neutral until March 1945, Argentine military and political circles harbored considerable sympathy for the Axis powers. Many Argentine officers had trained in Germany or Italy and admired the fascist movements of Mussolini and Hitler. The country's intelligence services maintained contact with Nazi agents throughout the conflict, and wealthy German Argentines allegedly funneled money to support Nazi operations abroad. When Germany surrendered on 8 May 1945, the chaos that engulfed Europe created perfect conditions for fugitives seeking to disappear. Millions of displaced persons crowded into camps across the continent, overwhelming Allied authorities tasked with sorting refugees from war criminals. The scale was staggering. By some estimates, more than 11 million displaced persons required processing in the immediate aftermath of the war. Allied forces, already stretched thin by occupation duties and the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union, lacked the resources to thoroughly investigate every refugee's background. Identity papers were easily forged or stolen from the dead, from abandoned government offices, or purchased on the thriving black market. Border controls remained porous, especially in the mountainous regions between Austria and Italy, where smugglers had operated for centuries. The International Committee of the Red Cross, attempting to assist genuine refugees, issued travel documents based largely on self-declaration, lacking the capacity to verify applicants' claims. In one documented case, officials estimated that 1,148 people received assistance reconstituting their identities in the chaotic post-war years. And in this confusion, men responsible for the deaths of millions could reinvent themselves as simple farmers, mechanics, or displaced Catholics fleeing communist persecution. The Allied denazification process, which sought to identify and punish those responsible for Nazi crimes, proved inadequate to the task. Courts were overwhelmed with cases, evidence was scattered or destroyed, and witnesses had been murdered by the millions. Moreover, as the Cold War intensified, Western priorities shifted from punishing past crimes to confronting present threats. Former Nazis with useful skills or knowledge increasingly found themselves recruited rather than prosecuted. The practical needs of occupation and the ideological imperatives of anti-communism combined to create an environment where justice took a back seat to expediency. Two primary escape routes emerged independently before eventually merging into a coordinated system. The first ran from Germany through Spain, then across the Atlantic to Argentina. Francisco Franco's regime, having survived the war thanks to its official neutrality, provided a convenient haven for fleeing fascists. By 1946, hundreds of war criminals had gathered in Spain, waiting for passage to South America. The second route passed through Austria and Italy, with Rome serving as the critical transit point. From the Italian port of Genoa, ships departed regularly. For Buenos Aires, their passenger manifests filled with men traveling under false names. What transformed these ad hoc escape networks into efficient smuggling operations was the involvement of the Catholic Church. Several priests and bishops, driven by anti-communist fervour, misplaced sympathy for their countrymen, or simple corruption, became instrumental in moving Nazi fugitives to safety. The historian Gerald Steinacher, whose research has done much to clarify the mechanics of these escapes, has emphasized that the Vatican's assistance was motivated largely by fear of Soviet expansion and hope for a revival of European Christianity, rather than ideological sympathy for Nazism itself. Nevertheless, the practical effect was to provide war criminals with the cover and documentation they needed to escape. The most notorious clerical collaborator was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric who served as rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Hudal had openly sympathized with National Socialism before and during the war, praising Hitler in his 1937 book, The Foundations of National Socialism, and maintaining contacts with SS intelligence throughout the conflict. After 1945, he used his position as the Vatican's representative to German-speaking prisoners and refugees to identify and assist escaping Nazis. His appointment to this sensitive position, given his well-known sympathies, remains a subject of controversy, with some historians viewing it as evidence of Vatican complicity, and others as a bureaucratic oversight in chaotic times. Hudal's method was straightforward, but effective. Fugitives who reached Rome would seek him out, often having heard of his reputation through the underground Nazi network that passed information from camp to camp. He would arrange temporary shelter, often in church properties or sympathetic households, and provide them with false identification documents. These typically identified the bearer as a stateless refugee, often claiming a nationality that could not easily be verified, such as Latvian or Ukrainian. With these papers in hand, the fugitive could apply for travel documents from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which issued thousands of laissez-passer passports during the chaotic post-war years. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by the scale of refugee movement and lacking resources to verify identities, accepted such documentation at face value in most cases. Once armed with these internationally recognized travel documents, former SS officers could obtain Argentine visas and book passage on ships departing from Genoa. Among those Hudal personally assisted were some of the most wanted men in Europe. Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp where an estimated 900,000 people were murdered, arrived in Rome seeking help. According to his own later testimony, Stangl found Hudal expecting him. The bishop provided sleeping quarters, arranged transportation, and ensured Stangl received the necessary papers for his escape to Brazil. Gustav Wagner, who commanded the Sobibor extermination camp, received similar assistance, as did Alois Brunner, responsible for deportations from France to Nazi death camps. A parallel operation of even greater scope was run by Father Krunoslav Draganovic, a Croatian priest based at the San Girolamo degli Ilirici Seminary College in Rome. Draganovic had served the fascist Croatian Ustasha regime during the war and fled to Italy as that government collapsed in 1945. From his base in Rome, he established a sophisticated smuggling network with connections throughout Austria and Italy and an embarkation point in Genoa. Initially focused on helping Croatian war criminals escape, Draganovic's operations soon expanded to serve Nazis of all nationalities. What made Draganovic's network particularly effective was its connections to American intelligence. The United States Counterintelligence Corps, facing the emerging threat of Soviet communism, saw former Nazis as potential assets in the Cold War struggle. Former SS officers possessed detailed knowledge of Eastern European countries, had networks of contacts behind the Iron Curtain, and had experience in precisely the kind of covert operations American intelligence was building capacity to conduct. The ideological transformation required to turn Nazi anti-communists into American anti-communist assets proved remarkably easy to effect. American agents recruited Draganovic's network to move their own informants and operatives out of Europe, creating a quid pro quo arrangement that allowed the priest to continue smuggling war criminals in exchange for his assistance to American interests. Declassified documents revealed that American intelligence was fully aware of Draganovic's activities and the backgrounds of many who used his ratline. In official cables, agents referred to the arrangement as utilizing Draganovic's illegal network while maintaining plausible deniability about its primary purpose of helping war criminals escape. The most notorious beneficiary of this arrangement was Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon, known as the Butcher of Lyon for his systematic torture and murder of French resistance fighters and Jews. During his tenure in Lyon from 1942 to 1944, Barbie personally tortured prisoners, including famed resistance leader Jean Moulin, who died of his injuries. He ordered the deportation of Jewish children from an orphanage in Izieu, sending 44 children and 7 adults to their deaths at Auschwitz. The French government estimated he was directly responsible for the deaths of some 14,000 people. After the war, Barbie worked for American intelligence gathering information on communist activities in occupied Germany. His expertise in interrogation and his network of former Nazi contacts made him valuable to his new employers, who paid little attention to his wartime record. When French demands for his extradition became impossible to ignore, the CIC arranged his escape through Draganovich's ratline in 1951. American officials later acknowledged that they had protected Barbie from French justice and facilitated his escape, issuing a formal apology to France in 1983 when the full extent of American involvement became public. Barbie settled in Bolivia under the name Klaus Altmann, where he would remain free for over 30 years, reportedly advising Bolivian security services on interrogation techniques learned in the Gestapo. The Vatican's role in these escapes remains a subject of historical debate. While individual priests clearly participated, the extent of institutional knowledge or approval is disputed. What is certain is that the Church's humanitarian agencies and diplomatic protections were extensively exploited by escaping Nazis. Vatican properties provided sanctuary, church-affiliated organizations supplied documentation, and clergy facilitated travel arrangements. Whether this represented official Vatican policy or the actions of rogue elements operating independently remains contested, though evidence suggests that high-ranking officials were at minimum aware of what was occurring. No country received more fleeing Nazis than Argentina, and no leader did more to welcome them than President Juan Peron. Elected in 1946, Peron had spent time in fascist Italy as a military attaché between 1939 and 1941, observing and admiring aspects of Mussolini's corporatist state. He travelled extensively during this period, visiting Nazi Germany, Francoist Spain, and other European countries, absorbing lessons about mass mobilization and authoritarian governance that would shape his own political movement. Though Peronism would ultimately prove distinct from European fascism in important ways, the influence of his Italian sojourn was unmistakable. Peron viewed the Nuremberg trials as a disgrace and an insult to military honor, a perspective he shared with many in Argentina's officer corps. In tape recordings made shortly before his death in 1974, Peron reportedly stated that he had helped as many Nazi officials as possible escape what he considered politically motivated persecution by the victorious Allies. His motivations combined ideology and pragmatism in equal measure. More practically, Peron sought to recruit German scientists, engineers, and military experts to aid Argentina's industrial and military development, much as the United States was doing through Operation Paperclip and the Soviet Union through its own recruitment programs. Argentina's ambitions to become a regional power capable of challenging American hegemony in South America required technological and military modernization that German expertise could accelerate. Former Nazi rocket scientists, nuclear physicists, and aviation engineers received particularly warm welcomes, their war records overlooked in favor of their technical skills. The Argentine government established formal mechanisms to facilitate Nazi immigration with remarkable efficiency. Peron appointed Santiago Peralta, a known anti-Semite who had previously restricted Jewish immigration to Argentina, as his immigration commissioner. Ludwig Freude's son Rodolfo became head of the country's first intelligence bureau. Both men worked to streamline citizenship applications for arriving war criminals and helped integrate them into Argentine society with jobs, housing, and in some cases, new identities. Documents suggest their departments employed former Nazis directly, creating a self-reinforcing network that protected its members while recruiting additional fugitives from Europe. Argentine consulates in Europe, particularly in Barcelona and Genoa, became distribution points for visas and falsified passports. Vice-Consul Pedro Solari Capurro in Genoa signed off on numerous applications with obvious deficiencies, apparently unconcerned about discrepancies that would have raised red flags in any legitimate immigration process. Officials were reportedly paid handsomely to overlook such problems and expedite processing, with funds coming from a combination of fugitives' personal resources, donations from the German Argentine community, and possibly looted Nazi assets laundered through Swiss banks. The network that moved Nazis to Argentina drew on multiple sources of funding. Some fugitives brought their own resources, having looted valuables from their victims during the war or converted Nazi assets to portable wealth before Germany's collapse. Others relied on funds provided by sympathetic individuals in the German Argentine community, who organized collections to support arriving countrymen. Questions about the role of Swiss banks in laundering Nazi gold and financing escape operations remain subjects of ongoing investigation, with recent inquiries suggesting that financial institutions may have played a larger role than previously acknowledged. The most famous Nazi to escape to Argentina was Adolf Eichmann, the SS lieutenant colonel who had overseen the logistics of the Holocaust, coordinating the transportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. Eichmann had participated in the January 1942 Wannsee Conference, where the bureaucratic mechanisms of genocide were formalized, and subsequently managed the railway networks that carried victims to their deaths. His desk-bound efficiency made him one of the principal architects of industrialized murder. After Germany's surrender, Eichmann was briefly detained by American forces, but escaped when his identity was not recognized. He gave his captors a false name and was processed as an ordinary prisoner of war. When the Nuremberg trials began revealing the scope of his crimes, Eichmann fled the detention camp and spent several years hiding in Germany, working first as a woodcutter on a farm and later assuming various identities in the chaos of occupied Germany. In 1948, Eichmann obtained, through an organization directed by Bishop Hudal, a landing permit for Argentina and false identification under the name Ricardo Klement. The documents enabled him to secure an International Red Cross humanitarian passport from the Italian delegation in Genoa. On 14th July 1950, he arrived in Buenos Aires aboard the ship Giovanni C., carrying the passport that would later be found in Argentine court files and donated to the Holocaust Museum in Buenos Aires, a tangible artifact of how easily a mass murderer could disappear. Eichmann lived openly for nearly a decade, eventually bringing his wife Veronica and their children to join him in 1952. He worked at various jobs, including positions with a construction company, a textile factory, and finally as a manager at a Mercedes-Benz automotive plant. He socialized with other German expatriates, including former SS members who had also found refuge in Argentina, and apparently felt secure enough to discuss his wartime activities with acquaintances. The German Argentine community, though aware that many of its members had checkered pasts, maintained a code of silence that protected fugitives from exposure. His sense of security grew so complete that his son Klaus began dating the daughter of a German Jewish refugee named Lothar Hermann, a blind Holocaust survivor who had emigrated to Argentina before the war. Hermann became suspicious of the family after his daughter described conversations in which Klaus spoke admiringly of the Nazi regime and his father's wartime importance. Hermann investigated and eventually provided the information to Fritz Bauer, the German Jewish prosecutor general of the German state of Hesse, who secretly passed it to Israeli intelligence rather than German authorities, fearing that Nazi sympathizers in the West German government might warn Eichmann. The Mossad operation to capture Eichmann in May 1960 was a dramatic affair that shocked the world and transformed international understanding of the Holocaust. Israeli agents surveilled Eichmann for months, confirming his identity and documenting his routine. They rented multiple safe houses, procured 8 vehicles, and assembled a team that included the legendary spy master Isa Harrell and operative Peter Malkin, among others. The operation's logistics were formidable. Argentina had not agreed to extradition, making the capture technically a kidnapping on sovereign territory. On 11th May 1960, as Eichmann walked home from a bus stop in the gathering darkness, agents intercepted him and bundled him into a car. Under questioning, he initially denied his identity but soon admitted the truth. Held captive for 9 days in a safe house disguised as a family residence, Eichmann signed a document agreeing to stand trial in Israel, apparently resigned to his fate. The agents smuggled him out of Argentina aboard an El Al aircraft, disguising him as a drugged crew member. Argentine authorities, confronted with a fait accompli, protested the violation of their sovereignty, but did not seriously pursue the matter. Eichmann's subsequent trial in Jerusalem, which began on 11 April 1961 and was broadcast internationally, brought the horrors of the Holocaust to global attention in unprecedented detail. For the first time, survivors testified publicly about the mechanisms of genocide, and the world confronted the banality of bureaucratic evil embodied in Eichmann's insistence that he was merely following orders. Convicted on 15 counts, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people, Eichmann was executed by hanging on 1st June 1962. His body was cremated, and his ashes scattered at sea outside Israeli territorial waters to prevent any memorial. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz physician known as the Angel of Death for his sadistic medical experiments on prisoners, also found refuge in Argentina. He arrived in July 1949, using a Red Cross passport under the name Helmut Gregor, obtained with assistance from the network of Catholic clergy aiding Nazi escapes. Unlike Eichmann, who lived modestly, Mengele initially enjoyed a comfortable existence, working as a salesman for his family's farm equipment business and living in fashionable Buenos Aires neighborhoods. By 1956, he felt secure enough to begin using his real name and requested his original birth certificate from the West German embassy. Argentine authorities' recently declassified documents reveal had extensive knowledge of Mengele's presence and identity. Intelligence files show officials tracked his movements, documented his business dealings, and were aware of his wartime crimes, yet no action was taken. When West Germany requested his extradition in 1959, an Argentine judge rejected the application, claiming it was based on political persecution. Mengele, apparently warned of increasing international pressure, fled to Paraguay shortly, before Eichmann's capture made Argentina less hospitable to Nazi fugitives. From Paraguay, Mengele eventually moved to Brazil, where he spent his final years in hiding, sheltered by German-Brazilian farming families sympathetic to his cause. He lived under various aliases, his health deteriorating, growing increasingly paranoid about capture. On 7 February 1979, while swimming at a resort near Bertioga, Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. He was buried under a false name, and it was not until 1985, when a multinational investigation tracked down his remains, that forensic experts confirmed his identity through dental records and, later, DNA analysis. The Angel of Death had evaded justice to the end. Klaus Barbie's post-war career demonstrated how former Nazis could prove useful to new masters. After his escape to Bolivia in 1951, Barbie built a new life under the name Klaus Altmann, obtaining Bolivian citizenship in 1957. He became a businessman with extensive connections to Bolivia's military and political elite, reportedly advising successive governments on counterinsurgency tactics drawn from his Gestapo experience. Some accounts link him to the 1967 operation that tracked down and killed revolutionary Che Guevara, though the extent of his involvement remains disputed. Barbie's past caught up with him in 1972, when Nazi hunters Serge and Bita Klarsfeld identified Altmann as the Butcher of Lyon. Their public campaign to bring him to justice drew international attention, but Bolivia's military government refused extradition requests. It was not until 1983, following a change in government, that Barbie was finally expelled to France. His trial became a landmark event in French reckoning with the Vichy period, confronting the nation with uncomfortable questions about collaboration. Convicted of crimes against humanity, Barbie died in prison in 1991, unrepentant to the end. Other notorious fugitives scattered across South America. Walter Rauff, the colonel who developed mobile gas chambers that killed an estimated 100,000 people, fled to Chile via Ecuador and Argentina. He lived openly under his own name, working as a manager at a king crab cannery and even spying for West German intelligence during the Cold War. When his identity became known and West Germany sought his extradition, Chile's courts freed him, and dictator Augusto Pinochet steadfastly refused to hand him over. Rauff died in Chile in 1984. At his funeral, mourners gave Nazi salutes and chanted "Heil Hitler." Franz Stangl, after his initial escape to Syria, eventually made his way to Brazil in 1951. He worked at a Volkswagen plant in Sao Paulo under his real name, living quietly with his family for 16 years. Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal finally tracked him down in 1967, leading to his arrest and extradition to West Germany. Convicted of complicity in the murder of 900,000 people, Stangl was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of heart failure in prison in 1971, just months after his conviction. His story inspired Frederick Forsyth's novel The Odessa File, which popularized the idea of a vast, organized Nazi escape network, though historians generally agree that the reality was more fragmented and opportunistic than the fictional portrayal suggested. The question of whether a formal organization called Odessa, short for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen or Organization of Former SS Members, actually existed remains debated. American intelligence used the term to describe Nazi escape networks, and survivors like Simon Wiesenthal insisted that a coordinated organization facilitated escapes. However, recent scholarship suggests the reality was more complex. Rather than a single, centrally directed organization, multiple overlapping networks operated semi-independently, sometimes cooperating but often acting without coordination. Former SS members, sympathetic clergy, intelligence agencies, and corrupt officials all played roles, but evidence for a unified command structure remains elusive. What is clear is that the escape of Nazi war criminals to South America represented a failure of international justice at a critical moment. The chaos of the immediate post-war period, the onset of Cold War priorities, and the willing complicity of multiple governments and institutions allowed men responsible for some of history's worst atrocities to live out their lives in freedom. Some were eventually captured and tried, but many more escaped accountability entirely. The long-term consequences of this failure extended beyond the individual fates of the fugitives themselves. In South America, former Nazis and their ideological sympathizers influenced political developments for decades. Barbie's expertise reportedly helped shape counterinsurgency tactics used by Bolivian military governments against leftist movements. Ralph and others allegedly provided similar advisory services to right-wing regimes across the continent. The presence of so many former Nazis created communities that preserved fascist ideology and transmitted it to new generations, with effects that persisted long after the original fugitives had died. In Argentina, the legacy of the Nazi influx became a source of national shame as the truth gradually emerged. The country that had once welcomed war criminals eventually became a partner in efforts to bring them to justice, most dramatically demonstrated by the cooperation between Argentine and Israeli authorities in tracking remaining fugitives. Yet, tensions remained. When Erich Priebke died in 2013, Argentina refused to allow his burial on its soil, a belated rejection of the hospitality his generation had enjoyed. In January 2025, Argentine President Javier Milei ordered the declassification of government archives relating to Nazi fugitives who settled in Argentina after World War II. Over 1,800 files were released through Argentina's National Archive, including banking records, immigration documents, and intelligence reports that shed new light on how these escapes were financed and facilitated. The documents reveal the extent of government knowledge about Nazi presence and the deliberate decisions not to act. Among the files was an entire volume dedicated to tracking Joseph Mengele, documenting that Argentine authorities knew his true identity, his business activities, and his crimes, yet took no meaningful action against him. These declassifications represent the latest chapter in an 80-year effort to understand and account for the Nazi escape to South America. Organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center continue to pursue remaining questions, particularly regarding the role of financial institutions in funding the ratlines. Investigations into Credit Suisse and its predecessor banks have suggested that Nazi-linked accounts may have been more extensive than previously disclosed, potentially including funds used to finance escape operations. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa has pushed for further disclosures, arguing that the full story of how Nazi war criminals evaded justice has yet to be told. For historians, the Nazi ratlines offer lessons about the fragility of justice in times of crisis and the ease with which institutional priorities can override moral imperatives. Now, the same Allied powers that prosecuted Nazi leaders at Nuremberg simultaneously recruited former Nazis for intelligence work and looked the other way as war criminals fled. The same Catholic Church that condemned Nazi atrocities during the war sheltered perpetrators afterward. The same international community that proclaimed never again allowed again to happen when immediate interests conflicted with accountability. Today, the Nazi fugitives who found sanctuary in South America are nearly all dead, their generation passing into history. But the questions their escapes raise about justice, institutional complicity, and historical memory remain urgent. In Argentina, in Germany, and around the world, the debate continues over how to remember these events and what obligations survivors and their descendants hold. The ratlines that carried Nazi war criminals to safety have themselves become part of the historical record, a reminder that the arc of justice, however long, sometimes fails to bend at all. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to the Waffen-SS After WW2. Next, a look at how Hitler's elite soldiers faced judgment, reintegration, and the long struggle over historical memory. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more Next Lev. Thanks for watching.